So the first question says, what are the benefits and challenges to claiming as fellow travelers, Jews who lived before this or who never chose to identify with? This is sort of what we talked about with, Einstein and these other famous people. You get more sources that are saying what you're saying, and get famous people who are like endorsers, of your product, so to speak. But you're sort of picking and choosing what you like out of them. And a lot of what they did that they're really known for is not what you're talking about.
True, but at the same time, I mean, we don't spring in the 1970s. It doesn't spring like out of the ground. There's obviously roots that go way back.
That's right.
And you have to look at that.
Right, and even for an individual who says, "Oh, Einstein said he doesn't believe in a God that intervenes in the world. He just believes in the, God doesn't play dice kind of beginning of the." Oh, maybe that's worth thinking differently about it. So it does have an impact on the popular mind. We should also be aware, though, that you can fall into the trap of the cult of famous Jews.
Yeah.
Right. There's a whole website industry called "Who's Jewish" or "Who's a Jew," and you sort of being the ethnic detective of which famous Broadway stars and which movie stars and which executives and so on.
The guy who played Harry Potter was Jewish.
Right, you might have never heard it. But and there are people who really get a kick out of finding out who's Jewish in this. The Forward daily paper will often say the Jewish side of X. There was just an article going making the rounds today, the Jewish side of Pi Day, because today is 3/14. So there's a whole article on the Jewish angles on Pi Day. Okay, fine, whatever. But they'll have like the Jewish history of this show or the Jewish history of that movie, and okay, whatever. But that's an angle people take. It's not unheard of. Okay. All right, next, the essays of Huber, Einstein, Freud, etc., are in the Judaism in a Secular Age anthology. You're welcome to take a look at those and see what they have to say. We talked about the benefits and challenges of using a personal story like Einstein as a role model, because it connects with lived Jewish experience, and you might find parallels to what they went through and what we go through. But it again perpetuates the cult of the famous, and it begins to smack of ethnic chauvinism, because you're only choosing famous Jewish people. And what about Mahatma Gandhi? What about
Robert Ingersoll?
Robert Ingersoll, right? Right.
Yeah, who clearly is a very important, or a number of the ethical culture people weren't necessarily Jewish.
Sure, exactly. And another challenge is when you choose a hero, they're not always perfect. I mean, how many heroes have we heard about in the last 30 years whose stature has taken a hit for any number of reasons?
Bill Cosby, Tiger Woods.
Bill Cosby, Tiger Woods, John F. Kennedy, Bing Crosby. I mean, yeah, you name it. We're debating over which statues get kept up and which statues get taken down, and the changing mores around that. There's a debate in Arlington right now over the Confederate statue memorial. I can't remember if they've removed it yet or they're talking about doing it.
Well, there's a section where there's the Confederates buried in that.
Right, but there's a special monument there that includes a slave and the statue.
Yeah.
So, we're reevaluating heroes all the time. The challenge when you put a statue on a pedestal is you see it from every angle. And sometimes those angles are not always flattering, and you find out things about them that are not wonderful.
Well, statues are put up to people that society considers to be heroes at the time, but that changes over time. And so someone like Calhoun, who was the hero, of South Carolina in the 19th century, now not so much.
Actually, Yale University, where I went for my undergrad, they had a residential college named Calhoun College, and they renamed it.
I heard that.
They also had a mural painted of him that had a slave boy serving. I mean, it was, this was done in the 30s or whatever, but people weren't thinking that way. They actually renamed him after a wonderful woman. I'm blanking on her name right now, but she was a theologian and a minister and had a PhD and taught in colleges, and she's really a fascinating character. It was a great choice of a Black woman to replace Calhoun as the namesake of the college. But that's the problem with when you choose heroes. They're human, and maybe it's an opportunity to highlight part of being a hero is overcoming your flaws. One issue that the general free thought world has, we were talking earlier about Center for Inquiry and so on, I mean, Robert Ingersoll was pretty good. He was pretty feminist. He was pretty, anti-slavery, anti-racism for his day. But then you talk about a Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson he describes himself as an Epicurean. He was absolutely a deist who did not believe in an interventionist God. He rewrote the New Testament, the cut the miracles. And so the free thought world has celebrated him for a long time. But he was a rapist. Who raped his wife's half sister, Sally Hemings. They had the same father, and then didn't free the children during his. I mean, it's appalling. How can you call this? And so people who are trying to encourage the humanist movement more broadly to become more racially diverse and inclusive and so on have said you need to stop, raising flags for Thomas Jefferson because he's too flawed in this core area to say he's a hero in that way. This is the zeitgeist right now. And, we'll have to see if we can land on a complex place where we can accept that people did good things and bad things in the same person. But at the moment, maybe tone it down a bit and don't say Jefferson was perfect. Or if you do mention him, mention his flaws too. But one last thing, whenever I see someone who posts about Isaac Asimov, who's a wonderful science fiction writer and was very active in organized humanism from a Jewish background also, very creative thinker. He has a book in just about every major category in the Dewey Decimal System. Is something absurd like this. He was also an inveterate sexual harasser at conferences and conventions. He grabbed, he squeezed, he rubbed, he kissed, he did all. It was like there was a whisper network saying, don't get in a room or in an elevator alone with him. He's going to assault you. And it was never publicly mentioned for a long time. So when somebody, presents him as an unqualified hero, at least we have to qualify, right? He wrote what he wrote, and maybe we can read some of his stories through that lens of his real life behavior differently than we might have otherwise. But we also can highlight the flaw at the same time. Number 4, this is sort of a core question for us the more we study this general philosophy. Why is it important for secular humanistic Jews to maintain a positive Jewish identity rather than simply join the general world of non-ethnic humanism? Why be Jewish? Why not just be a general secular thinker?
Because there's a value to the cultural aspects of Judaism, in my opinion. There's a value in maintaining. I can't think of what I want to say. There's a value in people's heritage and culture and whatever it is, and so to sort of blend the melting pot was never the great idea, and I think you lose something if you decide to just sort of blend in all together.
I've described it as if the world were only Applebee's. Where it's all just sort of bland Americanized. They have fajitas and whatever, but I like fusion cuisine. I like Cracker Barrel. I like fusion cuisine. I like ethnic foods of all different varieties. And if it all gets, sanitized, and a lot of times what people talk about as universal culture is white European culture.
Yeah.
They talk about Mozart and Beethoven. They don't talk about Yoruba drums or Japanese flutes that's not universal. Well, why not? Why are you privileging this one particular? Everyone comes from somewhere. Everything comes from somewhere. And we can be open to other cultures while still being rooted in our own.
Somebody told me once that every time a language dies out of the world, a different way of looking at the world disappears that you may never get again.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's true for cultures as a whole, not just languages, but
absolutely.
About languages.
It is. I think one of the interesting things, at least my particular ethical cultural group did when I went to Sunday school, was we spent time on religions of all different kinds of religions and cultures, and learned about everything from Shintoism to Buddhism and Hinduism, to open your mind that there were other ways of looking at the world and that they were all important and significant.
Right. I heard one scholar put it very beautifully. He said that Jewish culture is sort of like a piccolo in a large orchestra. Very small instrument compared to all the other ones. But if we don't play the piccolo, there will be no piccolo. And that will be a loss to what the orchestra of humanity would be. There's unique beauties to Jewish culture, as there are unique beauties to other cultures. And we don't have to pick, if we played only the piccolo as loud as possible, that's not gonna work in the orchestra either. But if we find the right way to harmonize, we can lean into the piccolo and play the piccolo as best we can. And Jewishness is a way of it being human. It organizes time, it organizes the cycles of life and seasonal and so, and it's okay to sort of live in your family culture and have a sense of roots. That's valuable too. It's part of psychological well-being. Even people who've been adopted often want to find their birth families and explore their heritage as a sense of getting roots and knowing who they are and where they come from. So why start by forgetting it? We can start by learning it now.
Well, and non-ethnic humanism, and what does that mean exactly? Anyway?
What are your holidays?
Yeah, what are your holidays, and is it really sort of Western European ultimately, or you know what I mean? And what does it mean?
No, well, that's what you were saying.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Also, on a sort of conceptual level, it's hard to wrap your mind around 8 billion people. It's like people who go to big universities, they join fraternities, they get involved in clubs.
Right.
You have to find ways to find community, and we evolved to handling communities of 1 to 200 people. And if you're only connecting to the community of 300 million Americans or 8 billion human beings, it's too big. And it's okay to break that down into a manageable size. All right. The last question I'll sort of leave you with to ponder is, which is primary for secular humanistic Judaism? The human-centered philosophy or the ethnic Jewish identity? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, I don't know.
That there are times that we do our Judaism through the lens, like the filter is the humanist philosophy. So what we find meaningful and valuable is decided by, that's the criteria we're using to choose. On the other hand, how we organize our time, the cultural languages we study, the history we're learning, the foods we're eating, when we're doing our Jewishness, that's not filtered through philosophy, unless one's an ethical vegetarian, and then it is filtered through philosophy. So it's a circle, it's yes and both are true, but it's an interesting way to think about how we're balancing this, because unlike most Jewish movements, we're explicitly ideological. We say, here's our philosophy, here are our basic beliefs, where most Jewish movements try to fuzz it so that it's accessible to multiple orientations and beliefs, and they don't put the ideology front and center. We're more willing to do that because it's part of what defines us. And so that puts us in a different category of trying to harmonize the Jewish ethnic inheritance, which we don't all agree with, but we're willing to admit the disagreement, and the humanist philosophy, which sometimes comes from non-Jewish sources and may disagree with those Jewish values. And we're not willing to say, let's just harmonize those Jewish values in some way to make it match what we think. We're willing to say we disagree with some of that past. Doesn't mean we don't love it and haven't inherited it, but it's our life and we get to choose what we believe and how we connect with our past.